It's a real delight and a privilege to be here today to talk alongside such wonderful scholars and with such a wide audience. So in this talk, I'm going to address the 4 questions set by Václav and the Lancaster team in relation to discourse analysis, which is the main focus of my work. So my research centres around discourse analysis and pragmatics with a particular focus on language and conflict, whether that's the performance of conflict and impoliteness or the discursive construction of difference and discrimination. And this image that you've got on the screen is doing double work metaphorically, as I want to think about perspective as a really core element in the value of the corpus linguistics discourse analysis intersection, but also to build a path through my idea of corpus linguistics and discourse analysis for you. So if we could move on to the next slide, the first question we were given is why the corpus approach is interesting for us. And for me, really, there are 2 macro reasons. The first and most obvious or often stated reason is that a corpus approach allows us to examine more data. And what this means for discourse analysis is that potentially we can get a more comprehensive view of the discourse. So this rationale for corpus use is perhaps the most common now, but it wasn't necessarily so in corpus linguistics origins, where the real innovation was looking at attested usage rather than introspection or elicited data. And so I think there's a strong tradition for the second point actually being the most important. So the second point is that the corpus approach gives us different ways of looking at data to identify discourse and discourses and discourse functions. As Sinclair said, the language looks rather different when you look at a lot of it at once, and this is what really interests me. And this is what I was aiming to capture with this image on your right, where the object of study, a barley field, stays the same, but we can examine it from above or below, we can zoom in, we can zoom out, and the context and the patterns that are made visible in those extremes of the continuum are actually quite different. Go to the next slide. These 2 macro reasons can then channel into more specific benefits of looking at discourse through a corpus linguistic perspective. The more data argument is both about achieving a good view or overview of the discourse, but it also more specifically accounts for the cumulative nature of discourse. So as Fairclough says, a single text on its own is quite insignificant. The effects of media power are cumulative, working through the repetition of particular ways of handling causality and agency, particular ways of positioning the reader and so forth. So if, like me, you're interested in persuasive discourse, this provides an important way into seeing that process of discursive constructions. The different ways of looking at the data argument gives a wider range of potential interests, which is partly why it's so interesting. So first, we might want to think about how a corpus approach enables both inductive and deductive approaches to discourse. And we could start off by asking a very broad question, such as what discourse features characterize my corpora or subcorpora, or what language features are clustering in my corpora. And alternatively, we can start off by testing a specific hypothesis typically arising from previous research. Now, in reality, of course, these 2 are often less neatly divided than published research suggests. But the key point is that both starting points are possible with this corpus and discourse approach. The next point is that we have the potential to be surprised by our data. And this is particularly the case for open-ended types of research where we don't go in with a hypothesis that only has 2 possible outcomes. But it's also an affordance of the corpus linguistic commitment to what Jeffrey Leach termed total accountability, where instead of stopping the categorization process at the point we've corroborated or falsified our tentative conclusions, we continue to look at and account for all the patterns. And as Alan Partington emphasizes, we may then serendipitously discover unexpected facts or be surprised. Next, and an aspect that I'm particularly interested in, is that we can use the corpus to create meaningful expectations of what could be in our corpus. And in turn, this can help us see what's not there. And we're going to come back to this in a moment. And another point that I'm going to come back to is that the corpus approach can help us to contextualize and recontextualize our data. So a common criticism of corpus linguistics and discourse research is that it can decontextualize, that the concordance line strips out information. And this can certainly be true if it's done superficially. As Kostas Gabrielatos likes to remind us, corpus linguistics is easy to do badly. But equally, we can use the corpus to gain perspective on the context of a specific occurrence, and we'll see that in a moment. Lastly, I'd like to mention that corpus methods are interesting for discourse analysis because of the potential for partnership with other methods, which Tony mentioned. So, for instance, in work on mock politeness, I've argued that when data is elicited, we should start with a corpus study of the items used for elicitation, such as sarcasm, to see what, if any, sociocultural connotations they may have which could influence the responses. Now, I said that was the last point, but as I'm interested in absence, I should probably draw your attention to the fact that I haven't said anything about qualitative and quantitative benefits. And that's because, like Partington, actually, I think the combination of corpora and discourse has pushed us to reconsider this distinction. And personally, I'm not convinced that there is discourse research which doesn't quantify at some level, or quantification that hasn't involved decisions made on qualitative analysis at some point. So in answering the next question about the value of using corpora in discourse analysis with reference to my own work, if we could move on. For simplicity, I'll just draw on examples from one project, Migration, Discourses and Memory. And this is a project I've been working on for the last few years, mainly because it's huge. And it started as a fairly inductive inquiry into the nature of migration discourses over time. But what became apparent was that it was impossible to consider how we talk about migration across time without simultaneously talking about memory. And memory comes into the picture in three ways: the idea of discursive memory, so the frames that are handed down and passed on across time and speakers; the idea of nostalgia and how past migration was construed at the time and how it's remembered now; and the concept of amnesia and what's absent from our contemporary discourse, but which was meaningfully present in the past. So for this project, the size of the data sets, the entire digitized output of the Times newspaper and the Hansard record of parliamentary debate, means it simply wouldn't be possible without corpus linguistics. It'd be absolutely necessary to sample. And how do you sample without corpus linguistics? Next slide, please. So I want to start this discussion of value with a very simple corpus tool, frequency. And the first open question I tackled in the project was, how have the names used for migration changed or stayed the same over a 200-year period? Because obviously you need to know how people are named in order to find the discourses surrounding them. And I started with a huge number of possible names based on background knowledge, previous research, colloquy analysis, and so on. And here I'm just showing a few items for clarity, but we can still use this to highlight three things that the corpus and discourse approach can show us. So first, we can use the peaks and troughs to decide where to focus our attention. Are we interested in the peaks for newsworthiness, or the troughs to see how people are discussed when they're not the focus of any moral panic, for instance? And we can do this in systematic and sophisticated ways, for instance, with the usage fluctuation analysis developed by Redzina, McHenry and Baker. And what's important here for me is letting the data speak for itself rather than starting with moments where we know that migration was newsworthy, or using statistics on mobility, because actually we know there's no predictable correlation between actual movement and newsworthiness of migration. Second, and as I mentioned before, a corpus approach can help us identify meaningful absences. So looking at this chart, we might notice that the term emigrants is dispreferred in more recent time periods. And there were similar findings for other terms such as evacuees, boat people, emigres, exiles. And so we might ask, are those people who were described as emigrants in the early data no longer newsworthy? Or are they described using other terms? And this leads us into meaning, the real value of using a corpus and discourse approach, because as linguists, we know that words change their meanings, meanings change their words. So unlike some work in this area, we would never assume that this image tells us about a shift in the form of migration which has led the debate without actually looking at the texts that make up the corpus. So as we see on the next slide, we can capture the meaning of emigrants at the abstracted level of the colloquy, and of course by delving into the text through the concordance line. And what this shows is that emigrants is not used simply and consistently to talk about people moving away from the UK. The most salient national modifier in the first time period is French, and British only comes in from 1900 onwards. Similarly, if we look at this text example, we can see that the Australian emigrants are not people leaving Australia, but people moving to Australia from a range of countries. So we can't equate this lexical item emigrants with people leaving the UK across that 200-year time period. And the corpus helps provide that context if we use the tools. Move to the next slide. Another classic use of corpus tools to bring value to discourse analysis is that it can offer us an overview of discourse patterns. And so staying with the most basic tools, we could look at collocations. And collocation analysis showed that one set of collocates that recurred with migrant names throughout the time period related to water. So for instance, here we can see river, influx, pouring, stream, all coming in from 1820 onwards. The next stage, of course, was to investigate this pattern and see how these terms were being used. And this analysis showed they were mainly metaphorical. We can go on to the next slide. And they realised a pattern of migrants of water. So this is part of that process that Anna Marchi talks about as being funneling, which is so common in corpus studies of discourse. So we identify a pattern and then narrow the search down, in this case from all of the collocates to identification of a semantic preference for the field of water, to identification of a metaphor, to code in the concordance lines to identify local evaluation, as you can see in this example here, which shows that the migrants of water metaphor could also carry a favourable evaluation from the perspective of the speaker. Not, I should say, favourable at all for the people being described, and that's a really important distinction. Go to the next slide. What I want to say is it's the second phase that I find equally valuable. So having funneled the search down, we reach the narrowest part of the hourglass. But then the corpus approach allows us to blow it open again. And this is what I mean by recontextualization. Because having found a pattern of migrants of water, we can ask, but what does this mean for the discursive framing of these people at different points in time? And this is a question about culture and context. And I'm not a native speaker of 19th century British English. And to retrieve those cultural connotations, we need to expand out and ask, well, who or what else was framed as water at those past points in time? So we can move to second order collocation, the collocates, the collocates. And in the next two slides, I'll just take a couple of examples to illustrate the value of this approach. So in the next slide, we can see flow. So this occurred with migrant names from 1880 onwards. And here we can see that through that time period, flow was used for liquids. So it was used with a literal meaning, and that's flagged up in blue on the screen for you. But you can see that it's increasingly conventionalized for money, highlighted in yellow on that screen. And so the metaphorical sense is shared across people and money. And this can tell us how people described as migrants are being conceptualized as capital, as human resource. And this contextualizes those positive speaker evaluations from the earlier time period. In the next slide, we see the collocates of wave, which shows us that wave collocates with water, flagged up in blue, and is used literally, but increasingly collocates with the semantic field of crime, highlighted in red. And this conventionalization for migrants and for crime takes place around the same time in the mid-1900s. So here we can see how the migrants of water metaphor actually draws an entirely different frame, which involves negatively evaluating people who move as a threat to society, like crime. Look at the next slide then. Just to summarize, what I want to say then about the value of using corpora in these cases, that it allows for the processes of narrowing and funneling, and then this explosion out to recontextualize and to explain the observations. So next, I'm going to briefly address the other kind of broad approach and consider the value of corpus linguistics for discourse analysis from the hypothesis testing angle. So if we go to the next slide, there are two interrelated rhetorical features of contemporary UK discourse around immigration. These have been well documented in discourse work, so we can build on that. And the first involves the construction of binary oppositions around good and bad migrants. And in this pattern, the group typically construed as good are likely to be geographically or temporally distant from where the speaker is now. And the second rhetorical strategy we see that's been well documented involves the positioning of the UK as a country which holds fairness as a cultural value, and therefore anti-migration moves are legitimated through reference to a proud history or tradition of welcoming migrants. So when looking at migration discourses from a historical perspective, using a corpus approach, two obvious questions are, well, one, did these oppositions recur in cycles in the past, as suggested by Kushner and others? And two, is there any empirical evidence of welcoming language at the point in the past where the present rhetoric claims or presupposes it occurred? So in reference to the second question, I can tell you I looked at this in detail with reference to the Windrush generation, and the answer is simply no. The current government rhetoric is pure nostalgia. But we're going to take a glimpse of the first as an example here. So in the next slide, you can see the frequency chart for the lexical item Huguenot in parliamentary discourse. So the group of people referred to as Huguenots were migrants to the UK in the 16th and 17th century. And we might ask, well, why does reference to this past migration occur in peaks around the early 1900s and 1960s? So if we take 1905, this was the time of the first major immigration legislation in the UK, the Aliens Act. And as you can see in the example on the right, mentions of Huguenots occurred in a politicized context. And the analysis showed that typically they were mentioned in binary opposition, where the Huguenots were the good migrants contrasted with the contemporary, undesirable, bad migrants, usually with an evaluation based on economic status or skills. Whereas in the 1960s, the peak coincides with discussion of new legislation to limit migration from Commonwealth countries. But here the main pattern was to politicize this past group of migrants, the Huguenots, to argue for positive attitudes to migration. So this hypothesis testing stage found two different results for the two different time periods. And what I want to say is that by looking at all of the occurrences, not just those that corroborated the initial hypothesis, we've got a much more interesting point for developing the topic further in the next stage of research. So to summarize, the principal value of using corpora in discourse analysis for me is about perspective. We go to the next slide. We can approach the data from different perspectives. We can abstract out, we can funnel down, we can recontextualize what we see. We can approach the language with the microscope or the telescope, and we can switch between them at different stages of the research. And I also like to say the key value that comes with the practice and conceptualization of corpus linguistics as a scientific process, as we've just been talking about, as these two instruments really represent, then brings with it a set of other values. So the principles of transparency, reproducibility, total accountability, and reflexivity, for me, bring great value to the practice of corpora and discourse. So now I'm going to move on to why innovation matters in corpus linguistics in discourse analysis. And here I want to say that innovation matters because there are three areas on which this approach depends that are changing. And so the intersection needs to keep up with all three of these. So first, we have corpus linguistics itself, which is developing and evolving. If we take one example, recently we've seen that advances in corpus compilation and processing power allow for much larger corpora. So to take my own work as an example again, I've been looking at the entire outputs of the Times and Hansard over 2 centuries. And so when we start this kind of long distance work, we need to develop new tools. And responding to this, we've seen Tony McHenry, Baker, Bradzina, creating new concepts and tools for investigating collocates from a diachronic perspective. So now, if you look at Václav's Lancaster stats tool online, you can identify consistent, initiating, terminating, and transient collocates in your corpora. Second, we need to keep up with developments in discourse analysis. And again, to take just one example, in discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis especially, there's been a strong trend in recent years towards a more cognitive approach. And so this raises questions for corpus and discourse work about how we can innovate to incorporate this. So to take an example again from my own work, I've become very interested in investigating metaphor. And as a community, we're still very much testing and developing ways of coding and identifying metaphor from different ends of that corpus and discourse tool set that will allow us to approach it both as a textual and cognitive reality. And third, I want to say that corpus studies of discourse are primarily studies of society. And so we need innovation to account for social change. To take a very obvious example, the rise of social media for interaction means that we need new concepts and tools, and those two always have to go together, the concept and tool. So for instance, how do we give value to a tweet that's been retweeted many thousands of times compared to the one that's received no attention? And for me, that's still an open question. My final slide then addresses the question of vision. And I have to admit that I've interpreted this more as a wish list than as a set of likely predictions. So first, my vision is to see a challenge to disciplinary boundaries because we need proper dialogue to develop. To take an example, last year I attended a European political science conference with many papers on narrative and rhetoric and discourse, and not one mentioned corpus or corpora in the abstract. And so this gives rise to two genuine questions, which is one, why aren't they using corpus tools at all? And two, why weren't we speaking at that conference? Second, I'd really like to see more embedding of discourse concepts and tools in standard corpus and discourse procedures. So of course, this is essential at the level of interpretation for me, but also I think at this point, we've actually got a set of standard tools that match up very well, such as transitivity analysis, social actor analysis, and so on. And the next step is to think about how to regularize that relationship and bring it into corpus design more. Third, I think there's a general movement towards more interactive tools and tools that can help us explore and visualize patterns in different ways. The graphical tool embedded in Lancsbox being an excellent example. And I think this will continue because it's about giving us new ways into the data and helping non-expert users interact with the data. Which leads me on to my fourth point, which is about more interactive tools for dissemination. So how can we allow users more access to our annotated data, for instance? We don't have, as far as I know, any journals that are only published in print now. So how can we break out of this idea of publishing as print, even if we're actually online? Fifth, I'd like to see and expect to see more work on establishing benchmarks or baselines for discourse work. And this is something I've been talking about recently with Anna Markki, with particular reference to metaphor, because I often read work talking about frequency of a conceptual metaphor with reference to a specific group of people, for instance, but we don't have any kind of information on what's marked and unmarked in frequency terms for that. And I think this lack of baselines also highlights the need for big investment corpora like BNC 2014 to give us benchmarks that will allow us to interpret findings from the specialist corpora that so many of us are working on. And lastly, and I think this comes as no surprise, what I hope to see is more reflexivity, spaces to reflect on what we do and how we do it, and to be open about how we work and how our processes direct us through that work. As what I say is indeed we need more events like this. Thank you very much.